Hey, thanks for clicking on my video. If this video helps you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel. It is greatly appreciated and it really helps. Let's get to the video. Let's talk about the characteristics of sine and cosine functions. So to start off with, we have a table here. We have y equals sine of x, we have y equals cosine of x. And so those two functions, and we're going to fill out their x and y values, or what the function value would be when x is the following values in radians that we see. So we have negative 2 pi to 0 and then 0 to 2 pi. So to do this, we're going to use our unit circle, which we have on the screen here. And we need to remember that in terms of our coordinate x comma y, the cosine would be the value of x and sine would be the value of y. Okay, and so now let's start at 0. So we'll start right in the middle of our table. And so we're going to look at our point that is located right here, which would be 0 radians, which would be the point 1 comma 0. So in this case, our cosine would be 1 and our sine would be 0, because in our unit circle, the radius of our circle is 1. And so from the origin to that point, we have a coordinate of 1 comma 0. So cosine of 0 would be 1 and sine would be 0. Okay, so now let's go up counterclockwise to pi over 2 radians. So now we see the point 0 comma 1. So cosine would be 0, and in this case, sine would be 1. Okay, now we're going to pi, which would be our 180 degrees. So now we have the point negative 1, 0. So cosine would be negative 1, and sine would be 0. Now we continue on to 3 pi over 2 radians, which would be 270 degrees. And we see that cosine would be 0, and sine would be negative 1. And then lastly, we get back to 2 pi, which is going to have the same value as 0, because 0 degrees and 360 degrees, or 0 radians and 2 pi radians, is going to end up being in the same location. So cosine would be 1 and sine would be 0. Now, to start at 0 and go back the other way, we're just going to be going clockwise with our terminal side rather than counterclockwise. So for negative pi over 2, that should be like starting at the standard position and going down 90 degrees, or down pi over 2 radians. So negative pi over 2, that's going to be at the point 0, negative 1. So cosine would be 0 and sine would be negative 1. Negative pi, we're going to get back to negative 1 comma 0. So cosine would be negative 1 and sine would be 0. Negative 3 pi over 2, we're back negative 270 degrees, so that would be the point 0 comma 1. So cosine would be 0 and sine would be 1. And then lastly, negative 2 pi, we've gone 360 degrees, or 2 pi radians, around in the opposite direction, or clockwise. So we're back at the point 1 comma 0. So cosine would be 1 and sine would be 0. Okay, so now we can use this table of values and we can actually graph these two functions. So let's go down and look at what our sine graph would look like. So here is sine. So notice that we have points on our graph and it makes this curve here. And so our range, we see on the left of the screen, our range is just from negative 1 to 1. Because if we look back at our table of values in our sine row, the lowest value we have is negative 1 and the highest value we have is positive 1. So now we go back. That gives us our maximum value, which would be 1, and it gives us our minimum value, which would be negative 1. So let me add a negative there. Okay. And then a couple other things we'll talk about. Amplitude would be 1 and the period would be 2 pi, and we'll talk more about what that means here in just a minute. So just to verify these points are in the correct location, we said that when x was 0, y was 0, so we see our point going through the origin. Pi over 2 was 1, pi was 0, so pi over 2 is 1, pi is 0. 3 pi over 2 was negative 1, which would be right there, and 2 pi would be 0, which is right there, okay? And so that's what our sine function would look like. And so now let's go down and let's take a look at cosine. So now cosine, we still have the same range, negative 1 to 1, because if we go back and look at our table of values, our lowest value would be negative 1, and our highest value would be positive 1. So now we see, go back to cosine, maximum is 1, minimum is, once again, negative 1. Still have the same amplitude and we have the same period. So let's verify those points that we had. So if we go back to our table, just starting at negative 2 pi going forward, we had 1, 0, negative 1, 0. So back to cosine, 1, 0, negative 1, 0, and just kind of repeats that pattern. So 1, 0, negative 1, 0, and back to 1. Okay, so that's what our cosine graph would look like. And so now let's talk a little bit more about period, amplitude, and some other important characteristics for sine and cosine graphs. So first of all, the domain is all real numbers. Okay, domain is x and y values. We're going to go left forever. We're going to go right forever. Domain is all real numbers. Range we saw in our diagrams, it's going to be -1 to 1 because our minimum value is -1 and our maximum value is +1. Now the amplitude is described as 1/2 the difference of the maximum and the minimum values. So if we do the maximum of 1 minus the minimum, which is -1, 1 minus -1 would become 1 plus 1, which is 2, and then half of 2 is 1, and that's why our amplitude was 1. So if we go back, we had an amplitude of 1 for cosine and also an amplitude of 1 for sine. Now we go to this idea of periodic. So periodic means the graphs have a repeating pattern, and hopefully we noticed that from the table of values. And in this periodic graph, we have what's called a cycle. So a cycle would be the shortest repeating pattern of the graph, and the period would be the horizontal length of each cycle. So in this case, it's going to be 2 pi. Because we go once we go a distance of 2 pi, the pattern begins to repeat. Okay. All right, and lastly, the x-intercepts. So for the sine graph, the x-intercepts are 0, positive and negative pi, positive and negative 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi, so on and so forth. So if we look back at our sine graph x-intercepts, we had 0, pi, 2 pi, negative 2 pi, right? And that just keeps going on in both directions. And then for cosine, we have positive and negative pi over 2, 3 pi over 2, 5 pi over 2, 7 pi over 2. So that's like 1/2, 1.5, 2.5, 3.5, right? So we go back and look here. Here's our x-intercepts. Pi over 2, 3 pi over 2. We would have a 5 pi over 2 over there, negative pi over 2, negative 3 pi over 2. Okay, so that's a little bit about the sine and cosine function and some characteristics of their graphs.